So today we're reading Teeming with Microbes, The Organic Gardener's Guide to the Soil Food Web, Revised Edition, by Jeff Lowenfells and Wayne Lewis. There we go. Turn it down a little bit. Chapter 10 Earthworms. Earthworms are the most recognizable of all animals in the soil food web, and, as it turns out, one of the most important to gardening. Most probably, the ones you will run into will be a species of Aparectodea. Uh, Icenia, or Lumbricus. Unfamiliar generic names for the most familiar of the 7,000 or so species of earthworms common to good garden soils. Technically, earthworms are segmented worms, or oligochaetes. Oh gosh, let me try that. Oligochaetes. Oligochaetes? And grow anywhere from a few inches to as much as a yard in length. They include the smaller, less familiar potworm, found in forest soils. Gardeners may not be familiar with potworms unless they have tropical fish, for which live potworms are a favorite food. Potworms are much smaller than the traditional garden earthworm. Let me reread that, I'm sorry. Potworms are much smaller than the traditional garden earthworm, only a few millimeters to a few centimeters in length. They succeed and replace earthworms in acid forest soils, which earthworms shun. And as unbelievable as it sounds, an acre of good garden soil contains 2 to 3 million earthworms, anywhere from 10 to 50 per square foot. This is enough to do a bulldozer's amount of work, and indeed, this crew is capable of moving an astonishing 18 tons of soil a year in search of food. In an acre of forest soil, one might find about 50,000 of their cousins, a large number, but small in comparison. Obviously, earthworms do not play as large a role in the soil food web of forests as they do in that of gardens. Early European settlers transported many earthworm varieties to the eastern coast of North America. The worms rode along in potted plants and ship ballast, and, one would imagine, arrived as valuable luggage cherished by farmers. Who knew the high worth worms would have in the New World? Once here, they moved across the continent in soils that held fruit trees and other nursery stock. They thrived. The only place in North America European worms have not done well is the warm desert of the Southwest. The common nightcrawler, for example, which is dominant in garden soils from sea to shining sea, arrived with the Europeans. Nor is the red wriggler a common compost worm. A native, though it is often called the Wisconsin red wiggler, still, it is a favorite, and rightly so, with those that maintain worm composting bins. All earthworms have the ability to spread into new areas, survive, and multiply to tremendous populations. Polychaete Yep, I think that was it. Oh, wait. Oh, it was the. Damn. There was the other one, the oligochaetes. I guess if it's the same last spelling as that. Oligochaetes. Oh. It had the same last spelling, though. It takes two worms to produce offspring, although worms carry both sets of sexual organs. Each has a slime tube in which to incubate eggs that are placed in a small cocoon. Each cocoon contains 15 or more baby worms, who themselves, once hatched, are usually mature enough to breed in only 3 or 4 months. When one considers that some worms live for 15 years, breeding all the while, their large populations in soil are understandable. Worms are a powerful force in the soil. Charles Darwin, who studied them at length, and even wrote a book about them, the formation of vegetable mold through the action of worms with observations on their habits, argued that every particle of soil has been through a worm at least once. Whether he was right or wrong, their role in the soil food web is key. They are intimately involved in the shredding of organic matter, the aeration of soil, the aggregation of soil particles, and the movement of organic matter and microorganisms throughout the soil. They also increase microbial populations and aid plant root growth. Eating machines. Although earthworms have no eyes, sensory cells in their skin are very sensitive to light. Their mouth, or prostomium, is a fleshy pad that looks somewhat like an extended lip. It, along with the worm's pharynx, is extremely muscular, but there are no teeth. What does a worm eat? Bacteria primarily, which is why it should come as no surprise that soils with large populations of worms are usually bacterially dominated. Other foods are fungi, nematodes, and protozoa, as well as the organic matter on or in which these microorganisms live. How does a worm eat? It starts by pushing its pharynx out of its mouth and uses it and its prostomium to grab food and bring it inside its body. Sorry, let me reread that. It starts by pushing its pharynx out of its mouth and uses it and its prostomium to grab food and bring it inside its body. In the food goes, and strong muscles start to break it down into particles. Saliva is mixed in, moistening things up. Next, the food travels down the worm's esophagus into a crop. From this storage compartment, it travels to the gizzard, an extremely strong muscle that is partially filled with sand and small rock particles. As the gizzard contracts and extends, the food is ground up by the sand, which serves as the teeth of the toothless worm. When the food is sufficiently ground up, it travels to the worm's intestine. Just before, however, it is mixed with a liquid calcium carbonate. Given their reputation for recycling organic matter, it is surprising to say the least that earthworms lack the necessary enzymes to digest it. Let me read that one more time. Given their reputation for recycling organic matter, it is surprising to say the least that earthworms lack the necessary enzymes to digest it, relying instead on bacteria. All the grinding in the gizzard assures what food does arrive in their intestines is sufficiently small and opened up for the bacteria living there to quickly digest it. Yeah. The more it's ground up and broken down, that's more surface area for smaller microorganisms, the bacteria, to to break it down even further. More surface area, the quicker they could work at it. Nutrients produced by the bacteria are finally absorbed into the worm's bloodstream, and any organic matter that is not fully digested is eliminated. This may be useless, a waste to a worm, but to a gardener it is a fantastic soil amendment. Vermicastings. Vermicastings, the name given to worm poop, are 50% higher in organic matter than soil that has not moved through worms. This is an astonishing increase and radically changes the composition of the soil, increasing CEC because of the greater amount of charge holding organic surfaces. Other nutrients, therefore, have the ability to attach to the organic matter that has passed through a worm. The benefits don't stop here. The worm's digestive enzymes, or properly those produced by bacteria in the worm's intestines, unlock many of the chemical bonds that otherwise tie up nutrients and prevent their being plant available. Thus, vermicastings are as much as 7 times richer in phosphate than soil that has not been through an earthworm. They have 10 times the available potash, 5 times the nitrogen, 3 times the usable magnesium, and they are 1.5 times higher in calcium, thanks to the calcium carbonate added during digestion. All these nutrients bind onto organic matter in the fecal pellets. Worms can deposit a staggering 10 to 15 tons of castings per acre on the surface annually. This almost unbelievable number is clearly significant to gardeners. The ability to increase the availability of nutrients without carting in and adding tons of fertilizer is about as close to alchemy as one can get. Let me read that one more time. Sorry, sometimes I read something and it's just like, oh, I trail off halfway through. Worms can deposit a staggering 10 to 15 tons of castings per acre on the surface annually. This almost unbelievable number is clearly significant to gardeners. The ability to increase the availability of nutrients without carting in and adding tons of fertilizer is about as close to alchemy as one can get. Master Shredders. Earthworms are classified as shredders. As they search for food, they break down the leaf litter in the garden and on the lawn, greatly speeding up the decomposition of plant material, directly and indirectly. They open up leaves and other organic matter, giving bacteria and fungi better access to the cellulose and other carbohydrates, and lignin, a non-carbohydrate, in the organic matter. Earthworms, then, obviously facilitate the recycling of nutrients back to the plants. At the same time, they may also change the composition of the food web community by competing with fungi and bacteria for nutrients. Indeed, even eating into their very populations. The magnitude of the impact of earthworms is shown by this simple fact. Leaves on the forest floor or in a garden or lawn would normally require 1 and perhaps 2 years to decay without worm shredding, but only 3 months with it. In some parts of the United States and Canada, forests have been invaded by earthworms left by fishermen. These have completely altered the floor habitat. Entire forests are affected as the litter layer is being decayed far faster than is healthy for the trees and the rest of the soil food web. The end result of worm shredding and digestion are minute particles of organic litter that microorganisms can eat. Microbial populations in the soil are also enhanced because some microbes are mixed into worm fecal pellets during their formation and elimination, creating protected enclaves of fungi and bacteria. Crazy. What? Alright. Here's a picture of a worm leaving its castings on the surface of a lawn. The little shit taking a shit. You can see the surface and then all the casting, the boobly poop. Yep. Reverse toilet. Burrows. Earthworms are incredibly strong, a necessity given the amount of burrowing they do. While making their way through the soil to feed, worms can move rocks that are 6 times their weight. Being in the soil provides them with moisture, temperature control, and protection from birds and other above-ground predators. Different kinds of worms make different kinds of burrows, some permanent and others temporary. The temporary burrows are often abandoned after they become filled with castings and litter. Roots grow into these pathways, able to penetrate deeper than they could by themselves, all the while having access to nutrients and the microorganisms that feed them. Certain kinds of earthworms move up and down in the soil, sometimes as deep as 12 feet. They shred litter on the surface and pull some of it into their burrows, where it is later decomposed. In making tunnels, soil from deeper in the ground is deposited on the surface. Other earthworms travel horizontally, rather leaving the top 6 inches, 15 centimeters of soil, but even these redistribute organic matter several feet, a meter or so away, though in the same horizon. Either way, this movement is akin to delivering food to another area of town and impacts the entire population of a soil food web. Earthworms also move microorganisms, whether attached to their own bodies or to the litter they pull underground, starting communities where once there were none. Earthworms not only increase a soil's porosity, but by breaking down and mixing organics, they also increase its water-holding capacity. Again, think of a couple of million worms burrowing about in that acre of good garden soil. Their burrows become significant pathways for water drainage and air passage. And since some worms move vertically and some horizontally through the soil, these pathways can bring water to all sorts of underground locations, whether put to immediate use by plants or stored for later absorption. Everyone loves earthworms. Other than birds, a few parasites and parasitic flies, and the occasional mammal, a mole, a fisherman, a tropical fish fancier, earthworms have few enemies. The birds they attract to the lawn eat them, but from a soil food web perspective, all is not lost. Not only does bird guano contain nutrients and microorganisms, but bird feet carry protozoa, and these are spread about when the bird hops from spot to spot. And occasionally, a bird will drop a worm into a new location, but not the early bird who always gets the worm. Look at the benefits of earthworms. They shred debris so other organisms can more readily digest them. They increase the porosity, water-holding capacity, fertility, and organic matter of soils. They break up hard soils, create root paths, and help bind soil particles together. They cycle nutrients and microbes to the new locations as they work their way through soils in search of food. With all these benefits, isn't it strange to count the gardener as one of the predators of the earthworm? Rototilling and other mechanical methods of turning soil destroy worm burrows and reduce or even destroy earthworm populations by cutting them up into pieces that don't even regenerate whole worms. And the gardener who uses chemical fertilizers is literally throwing salt on the wound. These chemicals are salts that irritate worms and chase them out of garden soils. A noticeable worm population is a clear sign of a healthy food web community. It means organic matter, bacteria, fungi, protozoa, and nematodes, all necessary to support a worm population, are in place. With these at the base, chances are the other parts of the soil food web are in order as well. Very cool. That was Earthworms, Chapter 10. Yeah. They play an extremely significant role in our gardens, the things that we do with it. Um, they're one of those. They're shredders, consuming things in the soil so that it could be broken down, spread out further. The It was funny how it was describing that it was actually like this toothless creature that was like kind of mashing down what it was consuming so that the bacteria within it could break that down further and commit to their processes, converting one chemical to another. Um, the the castings, their significance, and how much greater it is in comparison to what's been left alone without the presence of worms. The multiple benefits that their worm castings filled with nutrients, the way they aerate the soil, make it more porous by creating their different burrows, the manner in which plants can thrive off of that. The worms are another critter that, like the nematodes and some others, they are some nematodes, arthropods, macro arthropods. They would be taxis, carrying other microorganisms further than they'd be able to travel themselves naturally. Um, yeah, their gut microbes do the work for the worms. Yeah, it's pretty interesting. Yeah. And that I was describing, it's something that we talk about. I've heard it described a lot when folks are talking about using eggshells for composting to get the calcium and stuff. And that's a thing. Breaking down the eggshells as much as possible, because that's more surface area for the microorganisms to break down the eggshells from that point. It's the same thing with the worms. The worms unable to break it down and digest it further than what it can do by using its thick throat muscles to like do that to its food before everything else just digests it. Yeah. Oh my. Mm-hmm. I'll be right back real quick. Okay. So that was chapter 10. Sorry, I just reread what you typed. That's all when I was muted. Um, that's awesome. Yeah, exactly. It's making it readily available um, for the microorganisms in the soil, like it was describing with the worms and the shredders and what they're doing with their process. Like there's the leaf litter that was being left behind and breaks down in like almost what was this like almost 10 months. 10 months to a year, and then it was something where there was the worms within the soil and breaking that shit down, and it increased the process of the decomposition and like processing to like a period of 3 months. It's pretty cute. Yeah. All right. Well, I'm gonna have a quick toke before this next. Oh. All right. Teaming with Microbes, Revised Edition, by Jeff Lowenfells and Wayne Lewis. Chapter 11, Gastropods. What gardener hasn't had a run-in with certain members of Order Mollusca? Order Mollusca. Mollusca. Or perhaps you know them as slugs and snails. These gastropods, Greek for stomach foot, are often called mollusks, but whoever bestowed the common name with Greek roots had the right idea. Had the right idea. It is an apt description of what these organisms seem to be. One big foot that does a lot of eating. Most garden slugs are the size of a fingernail, but some species grow to 18 inches, fulfilling every gardener's nightmare. Besides, mollusks are usually associated with salt and freshwater creatures, clams, and oysters in particular, not the gardens. With some 40,000 species, gastropods are the largest group in the order Mollusca. Land snails, from which slugs further evolved, emerged from the sea some 350 million years ago, complete with the shells developed to protect them from their water-dwelling enemies and chemicals in salt water. As one would expect from their appearance and the damage either can inflict to a garden, both slugs and snails have a similar physiology. The main difference between the two is their snail shell, which is made of calcium. Garden slugs evolved from these snails over the years and, depending on the species, either entirely or mostly lost the shell. Slugs and snails are extremely susceptible to dehydration. Here is where the snail has an advantage to the slug. The slug must find cover in a moist area to survive dry times. A snail can pull into its shell, seal off the openings by secreting slime material that hardens into a thick, leathery layer, or operculum, and remain up to 4 years inside its sealed off shell. When the snail is ready to emerge, it simply eats its way through the operculum and is good to go. Why would snails evolve to slugs, losing such a wonderful device as a shell? Not having a shell has its own distinct advantages. Clearly, a slug has greater mobility and shape control. It can squeeze into spaces a hard shell would not permit, vastly increasing its scavenging range, reported to be up to a mile a night. In addition, maintenance of a shell requires access to calcium, limiting the areas in which any particular shelled gastropods can live. Slugs, who need less calcium, are under no such stricture. Their freedom to roam and ability to get new food sources is unimpeded. Garden slugs and snails are nocturnal, probably because this is the time of highest moisture or the least amount of drying heat. It may also be that this is when they are less susceptible to predators. They spend the day hiding in the soil or under debris. When nightfall arrives, they move about by gliding on a single muscular foot, through which they secrete glycoproteins, a sticky slime of sugars and proteins. The slime is manufactured in cells located in the snail's or slug's muscular foot and is exuded from the foot's center. The outer edges of the foot then stretch and slide forward over the slime. Slugs and snails are able to stretch up to 20 times the length of their bodies. A lubricant later hardens to form paths recognizable by other snails or slugs and gardeners, or by the same slug returning from foraging. Amazingly, the slime contains chemicals obnoxious to predators, just in case the gastropod is being followed. Slug and snails are hermaphrodites, meaning they are capable of self-fertilization. Most cross-fertilize, however, allowing both mates to lay 100 to 200 translucent oval eggs up to 6 times a year. These are deposited just under the soil surface, where they can remain for years until conditions, primarily moisture, are just right. They hatch in as little as 2 weeks, however, if conditions are right, which they usually are in the garden. Slug and snail juveniles are tiny, but they are ready to eat like adults and search for food a day or two after birth. They return to their nest each morning for the first several months. They become sexually mature after about 6 months and are fully grown after about 2 years. You might think they are eating only your lettuce and kale crops, but both snails and slugs also graze on fungi, algae, lichens, and rotting organic matter. Believe it or not, they don't graze only on surface plants. It has been reported that slugs spend a mere 5 to 10% of their time above ground. For every slug you see above ground, 3 to 4 are underground, foraging in the soil. Both snails and slugs possess a radula, a series of chitinous teeth not unlike a wood rasp, which allows these garden gastropods to grind their food down to very tiny particles. Many slugs and snails are capable of digesting cellulose. Snails and slugs have a place in the soil food web. They speed decomposition and decay by shredding their food before they consume it. Like earthworms and some of the arthropods, they open up organic matter so that fungi and bacteria can get at it. Their underground travels create pathways for air, water, and roots. The slime they produce helps bind soil. They themselves are a food source for ground and rove beetles, particularly in their larval stages. spiders, garden snakes, salamanders, lizards, and birds also. Some nematodes that subsist on slugs are now available commercially. These blindworms heat sink in on a hapless slug, parts of which become a meal for their successful nematode, while the remainder is left to bacterial and fungal colonization and decay. When gastropods are part of a healthy food web, their numbers are controlled. They do not become the serious pest they can be in a garden where the use of chemicals and other damaging practices have thrown the system out of balance. Very cool. That was the gastropods, the snails and slugs. Pretty interesting. Had a little explanation on how they do. They're very susceptible to dehydration. The slugs had evolved from the snails. The many advantages of not having a shell and some disadvantages. I mean, like the one we were saying about dehydration. Lack of moisture could definitely get to them, whereas the snail it was describing is able to put itself into its own cocoon, essentially, and like go into what do you call it? Like a hibernating state, essentially, for like 4 months. If things get too out of whack with the moisture. Another one that does multiple things. You could always talk about that. There are taxis in the soil. They aerate the soil. Their slime has multiple properties, binding the soil. I'm sure that there are things that feed off of that. It's what was it? It was proteins. Yeah, proteins and sugars in the slime made up for that. You know. Oh, sorry. The fact that they're in the soil, I think that a lot of people just kind of think that they like hang out outside of the soil, like under leaves in your garden and the plants and stuff, or like hiding along the stem or something, but they're in the soil. For every one you see above ground, there are 3 to 4 underground or something. That book I just described. Yeah. Oh, very cool. There's one more chapter, and we are complete with part 1, which would describe all the things that are within the soil food web. And part 2 is all about how you can use the soil food web to your advantage while gardening. Holy Moses. Oh God. Sorry, I totally. What was it? We got on the Snapchat the other day. Like a bunch of my friends are like, "Yeah, I'm on the Snapchat. All of these guys are on the Snapchat." I was like, "What? I want to get on the Snapchat and do the funny filters." You know what was funny was that I did one today. It was a Santa hat and a mustache and shit. And I just decided to do that even though I had a Santa hat and a mustache and shit. Sorry. Oh, too good. Alright, sorry. Let me get back into this. Sorry. Alright. One more chapter. It's literally one page front and back for the final chapter here. Teaming with Microbes. Revised edition by Jeff Lowenfells and Wayne Lewis. Chapter 12. Reptiles, Mammals, and Birds. We won't spend too much time on these larger animals. Many gardeners are plagued by them, but squirrels, mice, groundhogs, rabbits, chipmunks, voles, moles, prairie dogs, gophers, snakes, lizards all burrow and travel in the soil, mixing, moving, and depositing organic matter and providing pathways and reservoirs for water and air. Still, most gardeners would just as soon never see one in their gardens, either out of fear, reptiles, or hatred, groundhogs, rabbits, moles, you name it. If it burrows, and did we mention, sorry. Groundhogs, rabbits, moles, you name it, if it burrows. And did we mention browsing moose and deer? The role these larger animals play in a vegetable garden is very different from the role they play in other parts of the yard. But wherever they roam, their role is important and entirely underpinned by microarthropods and microorganisms, which far outnumber them in any soil food web. The dung of all reptiles, mammals, and birds serve as food source for other members of food web community, which recycles it into nutrients. They also carry microbes on and in their bodies and feed from one location to another. And at death, their carcasses are decayed by soil life. The activities of larger animals are more easily observed and thus better known than those of other food web members. But like all forms of life, their numbers depend on the habitats and food they require. The presence of birds in particular indicates that larger arthropods, worms, and larvae are about. So seeing birds hopping across your lawn or even in your garden should give some comfort. A food web is in place and at work. Of course, the same can be said of moles burrowing about the lawn in search of Japanese beetle larvae. You may not want to have moles tunneling in your lawn, but since you know how the soil food web works, you at least know there is a food source somewhere that is supporting the mole population. This should inspire you to do something about the moles without resorting to chemicals and poisons. Where do we humans fit into the soil food web? We have a huge impact on it, and very often not a positive one. Most gardeners have never heard of soil food web systems, even though they exist everywhere, and have no inkling of the role of microbes and arthropods play in them. Most gardeners have never heard of soil food web systems, even though they exist everywhere, and have no inkling of the role of microbes and arthropods play in them. And of course, the gardener hardly ever knows when enough is enough and almost always tips the delicate balance a soil food web maintains. Rototilling, spraying with herbicides, pesticides, fungicides, and miticides, compacting soil, removing organic material from lawns and under trees. All these human practices affect the soil food webs in your yard and gardens. Once a niche is destroyed, the soil food web starts to work imperfectly. Once a member of a niche is gone, the same thing happens. In both instances, the gardener must step into the full gap. In both instances, the gardener must step in to fill the gap, or the system completely fails. Rather than working against nature, the gardener had better cooperate with it. And this, as we shall see, does not require a lot of hard labor. Not if the gardener understands and teams up with the soil food web, letting the members do the work. That was Chapter 12, completing Part 1 of Teaming with Microbes.